David Tucker is our library acquisitions coordinator. He's the man who makes all the final decisions about which books the library is going to buy. Other authors love to meet David. Think he's a really, really fine man. David has written a delightful book called The Women Who Made Television Funny. And to me, I find it very interesting because I saw these shows the first time around. I was actually there when My Little Margie replaced I Love Lucy one summer in 1952. I saw it, and I immediately fell in love with Gale Storm, who I thought was just absolutely adorable, and I still think she is. And I was delighted to know that David was able to interview her. I look forward to hearing about that. It's interesting that where women were denied so many opportunities in so many businesses, in the 1950s, women shined on television sitcoms. There were a number of shows which demonstrated not so much that father knows best, but that mother knows best, in fact. And the number of women that David is writing about here, from Spring Byington to Betty White and other wonderful writers, brings back some wonderful memories for me, and I think it will for you too. And for those of you who are too young to have seen these shows, prepare to be entertained. This is a delightful book, and David is a delightful writer, and we are pleased to welcome, as I said, one of our own. David?
Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate all of you coming out tonight. I understand you have passed on your chance to watch American Idol and Dancing with the Stars tonight, so I'm impressed. I called Bill a couple of days ago and I wanted to know. I asked him just to make sure what exactly was expected of me when I did this program, and he told me that you all usually like about a 3-hour lecture with a test afterwards, so I'm taking Bill at his word. He's never misled me before. Actually, what I thought we would do is start by we'll give Bill a test since he says he knows all these people very well, and we'll see if you do too. This is my book. It's called The Women Who Made Television Funny, and as Bill said, it's about 10 women who were the pioneering stars of early television sitcoms. And I'm going to ask Joe to help me a little bit. This is who's in the book, first of all. So here's your cheat sheet. This is the answers to the quiz, just not in the right order. Okay, so what we're going to do with each of these is we're going to try to guess who said this. Now, who do you think would have said the reason my show is so popular is because nobody watches it, so nobody complains? That was Gale Storm, actually. Great sense of humor. As Bill said, I did get to interview her. She was a lot of fun to talk to. She's in her mid-80s now, living happily in retirement in California, and she was actually the very first person who nicely called me back when I asked for an interview for this book. So she's now one of my favorites. If she wasn't before, she now is. We had about $1.25 to do a show each week. This is Betty White. I don't think I did a great job on this one, so I apologize. I'm learning how to do PowerPoint on testing on you all, but anybody remember that Betty was a brunette once? Betty is actually in this book not because of the work that you might know from later, like The Golden Girls and The Mary Tyler Moore Show, but for a show called Life with Elizabeth. If we're going to test you on that one. Betty White actually started out as a local TV personality on Los Angeles television, and she did a show called Life with Elizabeth that was one of the first syndicated TV comedy shows. Oh, this is a good one. I like this one. Maybe every woman shouldn't necessarily be married and have children, and a lot of women would be happier and more fulfilled if they didn't. That was actually one of the interesting surprises of reading up on these people, was that sometimes they're not exactly what you think from what you saw on television. And Donna Reed was actually a very outspoken lady. And she did say that back in the early 1960s, at about the time when people like Betty Friedan were beginning to complain about some of the images of women on television. And Betty Friedan might have been surprised to think that Donna Reed would have agreed with her. She actually, the only other one she did, she was on Dallas for a year. She replaced Barbara Bel Geddes' Miss Ellie on Dallas for a year in the mid-'80s, and that's talked about a little bit in the book, and you can find out why. She says that nobody ever said show business was nice or fun or pleasant, and Dallas was the pits that proved it. Speaking of which, I think Hollywood has been terrible to me. Hollywood doesn't respond to a strong woman, not at all. How dare a woman be competitive or produce her own shows? This is Ann Sothern, Ann was one of Lucy's friends who was approximately of her same level of fame in the early 1950s, who, like Lucy, took a look at television and decided it was time to switch from movies to television after a good, successful movie career, and produced her own shows and was more involved with putting on her shows than some of the other women at a time when that truly was frowned on. If show business has been good to me, it has also robbed me of many things. I'd have liked a college education, the chance to travel, and time for friends. Show business cost me my first beau, and it eventually cost me my marriage. Joan Davis. Joan Davis is one of the people that is unfortunately not very well remembered today, and I really enjoyed getting to look at her work in writing this book. She died in the early 1960s. Her show isn't seen a lot anymore, but it's a lot of fun. It's a very slapsticky, I Love Lucy-esque kind of sitcom. She's a very physical comedian, very funny. Okay, this is not a quote by the person. This is a quote about the person. This is a lady I interviewed for the book who's the executive director of a very serious organization called American Women in Radio and Television that has a lot of very distinguished members, who said she was a pioneer in radio and television, theater, and movies. She really was quite groundbreaking for her day. She created a lot of the inroads that women today have been able to follow. Gracie. This was interesting to me because one of the questions I asked her was why American Women in Radio and Television, which has members like Katie Couric and people who have produced some wonderful documentaries, gives out an annual achievement award for television that's called the Gracie. And I said, is that not just a little, this is a woman who we don't think of as being remembered for being a brain trust, but it's quite true, actually. She's actually somebody who certainly deserved to be congratulated on her many achievements. And finally, about who would Groucho have said, I never found her to be funny on her own. She's always needed a script. This was a question that I think Groucho was asked near the end of his life because Lucy had been the young ingenue in one of his early movies called Room Service. And after she became famous on television, naturally, people said to him, didn't you sense that this was one of the great comedians of our time that was coming up behind you here, that this person... No. Talking about some of the own roles that she had played prior to television, this person said, I just don't like that dame. She's hard-boiled, unsentimental, and not me. Eve Arden. Wanted to get into television, among other things, because she saw an opportunity to play a different type of role than she played before, and said she was growing weary of playing the type of character who would often be written into a movie script as an Eve Arden type, who was the type who would walk into a room and have a snappy remark for somebody and walk out. Well, we're getting down to the last couple, so it ought to be getting easy now, but I have no patience with people who, when their hair turns gray, think there's nothing else to learn, no new fields to explore, who ignore the future and continue to live their life of yesterday. Or worse still, they sit around and worry about growing old. Spring Byington. Spring Byington is probably the person who, more than anybody else, when I told people I was working on this book and would list the people who were in it, they would say, who? Spring Byington was a very talented character actress who made dozens of movies, and it's actually probably kind of hard to find a movie on AMC or Turner Classic that you won't find her in sooner or later. You probably couldn't make it through a week of their programming without seeing her. She's in a lot of the wonderful classic movies of the 30s and 40s, and she starred in a very little scene show it's very seldom seen nowadays, called December Bride, which was a Desilu show in which she played a widow who moves in with her daughter and her son-in-law. And the show was supposed to be kind of a reverse on the usual mother-in-law joke, in that she wasn't a nag, she wasn't interfering, she wasn't a problem. And finally, I chose this one for the last because this kind of has something to do with the way I feel about all of these shows, and to some extent why I wrote the book. We live in a real world. Why do we have to take that as our entertainment? Good work. That's Anne Jeffries. Another one people don't always recognize, but you might know her for several different things. She was in a couple of Dick Tracy movies in the 40s. She starred in this television show called Topper in the 1950s, where she played a ghost. Some of you who watch daytime television might know her from General Hospital or Port Charles in more recent years. And she's one of the 3 ladies in the book who is still alive. That's my cast. Bill told you that he remembered some of these people from his own childhood, and I do too in a way, although I'm going to claim to be younger than Bill. Some of them were reruns in my case, at least. I did have a great fondness for some of the shows that I saw when I was a child, and that was part of what appealed to me about doing this book. I also wanted to do this book, though, because I thought that a lot of these people were on the verge of being forgotten or neglected, that there wasn't a lot of attention being paid to them. I also felt that there was a time when, around the era of All in the Family and shows like that, there was a great emphasis on sitcoms becoming realistic and dealing with mature subject matter and having challenging subject matter. And as good as that was in many ways, I think in some cases it came at the expense of disparaging some of the people who did some of the early shows. Sometimes there's a belief that these women played nothing but nitwits on their shows, that there were no good comedies in the early 50s compared to the more realistic shows that came along later. But these women and their colleagues who made these shows are pretty much the people who invented the television sitcom. These are all ladies who starred in a show that began between 1950 and 1959, so it is very literally about the 50s. So it begins chronologically with Gracie Allen, who went on the air with a live broadcast in the fall of 1950 after a very successful radio career. And the last one chronologically to appear on the scene is Donna Reed, whose show began in the fall of 1958. So those are the ladies that are in the book. And I did think that they were worth celebrating because television was a very young medium, and a lot of what we now take as a given about television comedy evolved out of these women and their shows and the people that they worked with. They also don't necessarily get some of the credit they deserve. Bill mentioned at the beginning that these were often women who were involved in putting on their own shows. Joan Davis had her own production company, and her show was produced by Joan Davis Enterprises, and that was not a normal thing for a woman to do in the 1950s. Donna Reed was actually criticized sometimes because she had too many opinions about what the Donna Reed show should be like. And there were certainly a great many people who didn't mind telling her she was just supposed to show up and say the words. If you go back and look at television in the fall of 1950, a lot of the programming was live, for one thing. Some of the networks were not at all sure that they wanted to encourage filmed shows. Some of the networks knew that as long as they originated programming out of their facilities, that they were in control. So, for example, when Betty White came along and had a syndicated show that was sold individually to local stations around the country, the networks did not encourage their stations to buy this show. They were very happy being in control of how things worked, and they were not necessarily looking to help invent competition for themselves. A lot of the shows that were on the air in the fall of 1950 when Gracie came along were still live. Most of the comedy was male comedians, people like Milton Berle. Often people who had a very visual kind of slapstick style. There was an open door, in a sense, in the early days of television because many radio performers were afraid of being on television. Radio was very easy work compared to television. In radio, you wear whatever you want to the performance. You have the script there in front of you. It's not that hard. You don't have to have any sets. You don't have to have your lines memorized. A lot of radio performers were scared of television and did not believe that they could put on a weekly show in the way that they had done a radio show. A lot of film performers were actually specifically forbidden contractually to be on television. The big-name actors who were under contract to movie studios were actually forbidden from being on television in their contracts because the movie studios were being hurt badly by television and they did not intend to help the enemy any more than they had to. I was just researching recently for another project that I'm working on, the very first broadcast of the Academy Awards in 1953, and there was actually controversy when it was shown for the first time about whether most movie actors refused to be presenters in the broadcast. Their studios would not allow it. If they won an award, they were allowed to step on stage and accept the award, but they were not encouraged to take part in this because it was a television program. It was also interesting when I was researching the book, there was a lot of information. I spent a lot of time reading the trade newspapers from that time of the industry, like Variety. I spent a lot of time actually in the basement of Emory reading microfilm until I gave myself a headache. There was a lot of conversation about what was called vidpics. And these women came along at a time when, for the first time, the industry began to realize that filmed television shows were a good idea. That seems kind of obvious now, but for one thing, they were not at all sure, and they were kind of pleased to learn that you could show a program a second time and people would still watch it. Sometimes in the case of I Love Lucy, it can be the 450th time, but that sounds silly, but they didn't know that back then. One of the reasons that Life with Elizabeth with Betty White was a success was that they could sell it to a station and they could show it a couple of times a week to fill holes in their schedule. A lot of TV stations back then were on the air with live broadcasts all day long, and that was quite an undertaking to keep on the air. Betty White's first job in television was actually being the co-hostess of a local Los Angeles talk show called Hollywood on Television, which was on every day for 5.5 hours. It was programmed originally very much in the sense like a radio show. It was a radio disc jockey who hosted the show, and she was his girl Friday who stayed alongside him and chatted with him. And in some of the early days of the broadcast, the television show consisted of you watching them sit there and play records. Of course, I Love Lucy had a lot to do. There's no way you could have done a book about this period and about these people without talking about I Love Lucy, because it was often Lucy's example that showed people that television could be a viable career. Lucy came to television when she was right on the verge of turning 40. She was realizing that her movie career was stalled, that maybe she never was going to reach the absolute top ranks of stardom in motion pictures. And so she decided to take a chance on a television show, and when it kind of worked out well, some of her friends like Eve Arden and Ann Sothern also went along to do television shows. As I said, I did a lot of the research for the book in reading newspaper microfilms from the time period. There is a show business trade newspaper called Variety that I spent a lot of time pouring through, and I would get little bits of information here and there. There was one little column item one day that said that CBS was working on some new shows, and one of them was this kind of Mr. and Mrs. type show with Lucille Ball and Desi Arnaz that they hadn't decided what they were going to call it yet. I put in the acknowledgments for my book, and I'm quite serious about this, that I did a thank you to the founder of eBay. And for those of you who've spent any time on eBay, you can probably imagine why that is. But a lot of these women were not terribly well documented in general interest magazines and books at the time. So I was able to go on eBay and I could buy these crumbling issues of magazines called Radio and TV Mirror and things like that from the time period and learn more about their careers in more depth. And that was thanks to eBay. And also, some of the shows that I write about in this book are very difficult to see outside of a broadcasting museum today, unfortunately, and I do think that's a real shame. There's a whole little bootleg business going, which there are some considerations about whether you want to participate in that, but that's about the only way to see some of these shows these days. December Bride is probably one of the most difficult shows to see, but it was a top 10 show at its time. My Little Margie is not readily available today. That's not an easy one to see, and there are very few good tapes or DVDs out on the marketplace of the Burns and Allen show, of all things. That's a very hard one to see nowadays. As Bill said, I did get to actually talk to a couple of these ladies, which was very exciting. There are 3 of the 10 ladies who are still alive today. One of them is Gale Storm, and like I said, I had a nice long telephone interview with her. She was very sweet. She gave me a lot of her time. I probably talked to her for about 2 hours altogether. She's living very happily retired in California. I think she appreciates knowing that people are interested in her career. She actually still has a fan club of people who are followers of hers, and I think she deserved the credit, and I was happy to give it to her, and I really enjoyed getting to meet her, and she's a very funny lady, actually. She has a great sense of humor. She was talking to me one day, and we were winding down, and she said she had to excuse herself because the doctor was coming over to the house to give her a shot or something. She said, I won't tell you exactly what he's coming here to do. I'll just tell you that I need to go in a minute. But she was also very open and very honest. Gale Storm was one of the very first people to talk openly about the fact that she became an alcoholic. And this is not maybe what we think of happening in life to my little Margie, but she went through a very difficult time with alcoholism, and she's very happy to talk about it honestly, and she was very straightforward in talking to a stranger about it. As I said, I did get to talk to Betty White, and one of the strange things was that her secretary very nicely called me back about 4 days after I wrote a letter and asked for an interview, and I somehow didn't imagine that the hardest thing about interviewing a woman in her mid-80s would be to catch her on her day off, because it was actually very difficult for her secretary to squeeze me into her schedule because she is out there working. And she recently did, in fact, turn 85, and she's still lively as ever and fun to interview. And at the very last minute, very shortly before I had to turn in the book, I was able to get an interview with a gentleman named Sherwood Schwartz, who some of you probably know from Gilligan's Island. But the reason I wanted to interview him for this book was that he was also a writer on I Married Joan. And so he was one of the few people around today who could tell me anything about Joan Davis and what it was like to work with her. And it was very interesting to hear his perspective. He told me something that I'd not heard before, which was, at that time it was far more common for there to be 2 or 3 staff writers for a show rather than a lot of freelancers, which is what you get today. But he told me that there were, I believe, 3 or 4 staff writers on I Married Joan, and one of them had the assignment every week to go to the set and keep her company. There was a writer on call within reach at all moments. The reason for that being, as she rehearsed and as they shot the show, if all of a sudden she thought the scene was no good, if it was falling apart, she would then turn to this lucky writer and say, "Give me something funnier." There were 50 or 60 people standing around, lighting people and crew members and makeup people, and it's like, no pressure, just give me something funnier. I got to talk to Eve Arden's son, which was very nice. And actually, the one person I missed out on getting to interview, just that I very much wanted to interview, I finally got to meet the other day, which is kind of a strange little story, but I wrote Ann Jeffries a letter about 1.5 years ago asking her to give me an interview for this book, because she's the other of the 3 ladies who are still alive today. And she actually has been through some kind of difficult times. She had a very long-term marriage to her topper co-star, Robert Sterling, who died about this time last year. So when I heard that, I figured she was otherwise occupied. But she finally surfaced, and I came home from dinner the other night, and there was a message on the machine. "Hi, David, this is Ann Jeffries. I guess I'm a little late answering your nice letter from February 2006. I called her back. I did not get to talk to her, but I did appreciate it. And like I said, right after I turned in the manuscript last summer, I heard that her husband had died, so I figured she had 1 or 2 other things on her mind. That's the book. That's what I know about it. I appreciate you all skipping American Idol and whatever other reality shows you could have been watching tonight. And if I'm still under a half hour's running time, that seems kind of appropriate for the topic, so. I have until the end of September. I'm writing a book that's a combination of a biography and a career history of another person you might know, an actress named Shirley Booth from Hazel. So, yeah.
I was wondering how you selected those 10. I was thinking that there are others like Audrey Meadows and Jackie Gleason's show and Victor Vance and Vicky Poca. Were those the only ones we were able to find the studio on?
No, actually, I decided I wanted to do a nice even number, like 10 or 12, and so I had to set some parameters. And what I finally ended up setting was people who were the principal leads in a show that began between 1950 and 1959, and who were the primary comedic character on that show. And actually, of the people I chose, Gracie Allen is the only one who was not the top billed star of her show, because as you know, it was always George Burns and Gracie Allen, but I think even George wouldn't argue who the real funny person was there in that show. But yeah, by choosing people who were the leads of their own shows during that particular time period, it left out people who were in sketch comedy shows, people who played a secondary role in a show. But boy, I could easily fill up a second book, couldn't I? Actually, that's how I got on Shirley Booth, because I was thinking about doing a 60s volume, and then I kind of got interested in Shirley, so I never made it much past the B's. It was interesting to me, like I said, that Donna Reed was a very outspoken person, even at the time. She once said, in one quote that I read from about that time period, she said that one of the reasons she was sick of being in movies was that she was sick of having somebody come over every day and look at her and figure out if her costume was tight enough to show off her breasts. Because that was, I'm not sure how many people just would have said that out loud and plain in 1963 or whenever that was, but she did. She was a very truthful lady. Gale Storm, like I said, was just a hoot, just a lot of fun. Just very quirky little sense of humor. Doesn't hear well, so I shouted at her a lot. It varies. What I tried to do in each chapter tries to do a couple things. It tries to give a little bit of the history of the show, a little bit of a sense of what the show was like. There's usually some dialogue quotes from the shows. There are photographs from the shows in the book. And then I used a combination of contemporary sources, and in some cases what I could mostly find was information that came out at the time about the people and what was going on in their lives, because again, we are talking about people who were professionally active 55 years ago. But I did interview 2 of the 3 ladies that are still alive, and when it was possible, I tried to also interview people like, I tracked down another actor that you all may know named Robert Fuller, who did a show called Emergency, because he was one of the, who my sister had a big crush on, if I remember correctly, who was one of the few people who could tell me about Spring Byington, who's still around. But that was actually one of the challenges, and one of the reasons I'm glad I went ahead and did the book is that the people who knew these people are not going to be around a whole lot longer. Sherwood Schwartz was a good interview to talk to, too, but he's not a young man either. Yes, sir. By the time she was doing that show in the 50s, I think she would have been perfectly happy to go home and retire. Her husband was the one who really had the ambition for the family. He was the one who desperately loved show business and desperately wanted to be on television. She was at least in her 50s. There are different versions of her age depending on who you believe. She had something of a heart condition. The one person I was able to interview who actually worked with her on the set just said she was a very nice, quiet lady. She just came, did the stuff, did her work, total professional, went back to her dressing room. I think she, quite frankly, was tired by the 1950s. And also, you can just imagine trying to learn some of her dialogue and memorize it for a live show. Because very often, you're so dependent, I think, if you're acting on the person that you're acting, you're making sensible replies to things. But if you're trying to learn dialogue that goes all over the place and doesn't make a great deal of sense, and also, as her son said, the hard thing about her role was that if she didn't say it exactly right, it wasn't funny. She had to say it in just so, these really loopy things in just such a way that the audience would go, well, she's right. You know, when she explains to you that someone tells her that they write for a Buffalo newspaper, and she tells them she didn't know buffaloes could read. Yes, sir. No. She actually, we talked a little bit about Dallas. She was on Dallas for a year in the mid-1980s, and she developed, I'm blanking on it, I could look it up in the book, I believe it's pancreatic cancer within a few months of leaving that show. She actually sued the producers of Dallas for signing her to take the place of Barbara Bel Geddes as Miss Ellie, firing her after a year, bringing back Barbara Bel Geddes. She refused to go along with the story that they were putting out to the media that she was only a stand-in anyway and that she was happy to step aside. She said she was told by a reporter getting off a plane that she was the one who'd lost her job before anyone on the show told her. And so she actually took them to court and collected her entire salary for the next 2 years as a settlement. But she died about a year after she left that show. Yeah.
What do you think these ladies would have thought about television comedy today?
I will say, and I almost wanted them to slam it for me, and I asked Gale Storm even what she thought about later shows like All in the Family, and she said, oh, I thought it was cute. So she was very willing to consider another point of view. Lucy was well known to have despised things like All in the Family and to have considered that that was absolutely the wrong approach to comedy. And I sure hope that they all would kind of hate the reality TV trend as much as... I think actually that's another reason why I was interested in doing the book and why people seem to be interested in the book is that so many of us are a little bit sad that there's nothing but contests of people doing unpleasant things to themselves or each other on television. It varied with each show. Some of them I was real familiar with, so I almost didn't need to, except if I wanted to catch a particular bit of dialogue or something like that. Like I said, the one that was probably the hardest to see was December Bride, that I was actually only able to see about 6 or 8 episodes of. There are some of them you can get on DVDs from places like oldies.com that have just, they're bootlegs. But like I said, you know, I'd be happy to buy the real thing if they would put it out, so I don't feel too guilty if... There were a couple of people while I was working on the project who were selling more complete sets on eBay, but I have a feeling they got kind of slapped down by somebody more familiar with copyright because they tend to disappear off the site not too long. But some of them I was able to see no more than 5 or 6 shows. Some of them I was very familiar with, and I will plead guilty to not needing to see I Love Lucy to write about it. You know, it's somebody was writing a book for the same publisher, and I don't mean to pick on All in the Family because I actually like the show, but somebody was writing a book from almost the opposite viewpoint at the same time, talking about how good it was that Norman Lear came along and gave some substance to television, saying that none of it was all just brainless fluff before he got there. I don't know. I remember reading at one point a few years ago that as opposed to, say, I Love Lucy, which was largely written by 3 or 4 people, that at one point, at the height of her popularity, Roseanne had 24 staff writers on contract, which you got to figure if they each wrote one good joke a week, you'd have a half-hour show. But I don't know. It's hard to say. I mean, I'm not sure I think people still can appreciate these, and I hope that they will go back and look at them and appreciate character comedy and something that doesn't make us stress about our lives. It can be a real escapist release from life. I did a talk on the book the day that the whole Virginia Tech thing happened. And in a sense, I felt, well, this is just such a frivolous, silly thing to be talking about on a day when such a terrible thing has happened. But then I thought, you know, that's part of what I like about these shows, is that they're not going to remind me of anything painful or upsetting. They're not going to work me too hard. they're just fun. Well, thank you all very much.